Welcome to another installment of Jay's Analysis. Today we're going to be talking to Ortho Bro Snek. Once again, he joins us to cover the issue of the Franks. Now, we've mentioned this in the past. We've covered it when we discussed the superstitions that emerged in the Latin church over time, but we haven't really delved into this issue of the Merovingians, the Franks, Charlemagne, Frankish Thesis, this kind of stuff. So there's new stuff that has come to light that I've seen that Snek has uncovered as well. So we want to get his insights and his analysis, documents that he's looked at, forgeries he's discovered. So where do you want to start us off?
First, I'd like to start by thanking you for having me again, and to thank all the people I'm working with, people from my collective, and people in France, French clergy, Father and Photios, who helped me find new informations and rehabilitate a part of French history, which is a Merovingian part. We're going to touch on that. So yeah, that would be my introduction. But basically, the main point we're going to cover here is that Rome and many of the claims of Rome today emerged from, to a level, political machinations from the Franks, but not from all of the Franks. Basically, we're going to uncover the fact that there was a big shift at some point in ecclesiology in the West, not only in Rome, but in the Frankish church, and that these problems of ecclesiology manifested themselves by problems of the creed, of theology. We're going to talk about the Filioque, of course. To show that basically what people tend to call the Frankish Thesis, the idea that the Franks subverted the church, isn't really much of a conspiracy theory. It's being accepted. And we've discussed with many French clergymen, particularly Father and Photios, who was supervising us with a Euro monk in southern France. And it's up to the position that we hold, and we're going to see that in the light of history, in the light of some new developments, we can pinpoint it quite easily.
Yeah, I want to add too that I'm going to include down below a couple links for people that are interested, because I did finally find the Philippides book. There's a historical treatise by Mr. Philippides, and let me see exactly what it's called. His name is Anastasios Philippides, and he has a whole book on this very topic. It's called Romanity or Barbarity: The Historical Problems of the Roman Empire, Hellenism, and the West. I don't think it's in print. It's only on PDFs or online. So I'll have that linked below. And then also relevant to this will be the Dionysius Dragus essay on the 8th Ecumenical Council and Photios and the Franks. So I'll include those down below. Those are all relevant. So go ahead, kick us off here. What do you want to get into?
I think we're going to go about it chronologically. And we're going to look at what France was at the time of its evangelization. So first of all, it began in Gaul, which already was quite Christianized. And during the barbarian invasions, you have one tribe that came to dominate the other, which were the Franks. And at some point, there's the baptism of the king of the Franks, the baptism of Clovis. And what we can see is that from the get-go, from the very beginning, you have this idea of symphonia. You have this idea of royal sainthood that is very present. So if we look at the author of the period, St. Gregory of Tours, he will talk about the baptism of Clovis in his History of the Franks. And you see all the Byzantine codes. Many will call it Caesar papism today. But for example, when Clovis is baptized, first of all, it's an Orthodox baptism. It's directly followed by the chrismation. There's the Orthodox understanding of the removal of sin through baptism. And immediately, what's striking is that Clovis is not compared to Peter or someone. He is compared to Constantine. This is the main thing, because the idea of the saint emperor is a shift away from Rome. So today, there's something that shocked me coming to Orthodoxy, is that when you look at the saint emperors, it's very revered in the East and not so much in the West. And some of them are not even in the calendar anymore. So you have people in Rome who claim the chrism, who claim all the things that Constantine did, and they say, oh, Constantine is not really a saint, maybe, well, except for the unions. And you have from the get-go this idea of the king being the representative of the people and embodying this covenant of the kingdom. It's a Davidic covenant, something that completely was destroyed later on in Rome. And yeah, that's the most striking thing, direct comparison to Constantine. And then you have an entire period of Merovingian sort of small duchies, fractured kingdom, where the nobility is very reminiscent of what you will see later on in Anglo-Saxon England or in Rurikhovich Russia, which is some principalities and the kings and princes moving to monasteries at some point.
Yeah.
A lot of royal saints, for example, Saint Clodoald, Saint Cloud in French, is a grandson of Clovis. It's very well revered. You have all this thing very reminiscent, for example, what you see with Saint Alexander Nevsky, who is a prince of Novgorod at some point and then retires to monastery. So even the comparison between Clovis and Vladimir is striking. And since Clovis is not a canonized saint, even though we can find some early veneration of him, that's what made me feel very close to Saint Vladimir, for example, because it's a direct comparison. So in the organization of the church at the time, and in the organization of its power relative to the kings, it is the Sinfonia that you like to talk about.
Real brief. Let me add just a little bit on the notion how this kind of developed. So in the Old Testament, you have the promise of the Davidic king all the way back in Genesis, and so from my vantage point, this is kind of debated a lot in different theological traditions and circles of whether the Bible is monarchical or whether it's some other form of government, republicanism or something like that, which people actually try to argue. But I think it's pretty clear that the Old Testament promises are of a monarchy. There's stipulations in the law of Moses about how the king should operate. And in fact, when we look at Solomon, he failed to abide by the stipulations that the Mosaic law had upon the king. So none of that in itself, though, suggests that somehow monarchy or the king is inherently evil or bad or whatever. It's a common misunderstanding. And in fact, there's many places in Scripture, Proverbs, the book of Judges, where the people are castigated for not having and following a righteous king. When there is, of course, the statement that everybody goes to where, Samuel says, well, you want a king to be like the nations around you. So Israel was clamoring for this kind of pagan warrior king. And that's what the rebuke is about. It's not about a form of government itself. So all the way up into the New Testament, we find this consistent principle, as you said, of Symphonia. Paul outlines this clearly in Romans 13, where he says that even the emperor is a diakonos of God, so he has a ministerial role. And the confusion here arises a little bit in the early church, where some of the post-apostolic fathers and writers are a little unclear. Part of that is because some people thought there was going to be an imminent return, right? So if you're in this period of persecution for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, where it was heavily persecuted, there was a lot of writing that thought, well, Christ is going to, this is a wicked world. Christ is going to save us. There's no point in thinking about the relationship between church and state. That's one mindset or position that was being debated in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. Some of the groups like the Montanists, for example, Tertullian, they ended up taking a very anti-state approach. They thought, this is all the devil's domain or whatever. However, it's not all one-sided. There was a lot of debate. There was questions and things that arose, like you can find in the letters of Clement, for example. He talks about the legitimacy of the death penalty. He says we don't reject the idea of the state itself. We don't reject these things only when they overstep their bounds and try to trample on the law of God. So there's both of these ideas kind of present in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. Well, what eventually wins out, obviously, is that when Constantine, and it's not really with Constantine, it's actually with Theodosius that we begin to see the beginning of Christian laws. So the church kind of explicates this in more precise way by the time that, Byzantium comes to preeminence when you get these Byzantine rulers. That's not to say that there weren't heretical rulers. Obviously there were, but to make this short and sweet, by the time we get to the 6th and specifically the 7th Ecumenical Council, there's a lot of the terminology, a lot of the phraseology that's used in the acts and letters of those councils that speak of the emperor, or even the empress perhaps, or both of them, as the God-ordained emperors. So at Nicaea II, you get a really clear explication in the Acts of the Council and in the opening of the Council, the letter to the Emperor, of the idea that the Orthodox Imperium is what God has providentially sort of ordained, right? And so that's why we'll get this problematic situation when we have the ordination of a separate Imperium for the West.
Yeah, exactly. May I just add that there's one position that you do not find in the early church is the idea that the church and representative from the clergy rule above the state. Actually, part of the Bible that says no direct theocracy like this. In the
Like
sense
the papacy, like the idea that Peter can, he's above everybody in the world, even every ruler.
Yeah. And that's what you see in the Franks too. So, for example, in 511, still under Clovis, it's the very end of his reign, there's a Council of Orleans, and in this Council of Orleans, they express some level of interaction between state and church, and they explain that since the church is not taxed, if someone wants to join the clergy, they need to have some level of approval from the king, except if they are sons of clergy, which also shows that in the West at the time, people were clergy were having children in wedlock, which is also interesting. So you have this idea from the get-go of this interaction, intricate interaction between church and state without one really taking over the other. And it's also a great time to talk about how the Merovingians, so the Merovingians are the first French dynasty. As the Merovingians, sons of Clovis, understood their relations with Byzantium, with the empire, the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. And Clovis understood his role as Rex, as a king, not as an emperor. And he actually took the mantle of council, so he had the seal and the mantle of council. During archaeological finds, we even found that his father was buried with this imperial insignia. So he understood his role with the universal empire, which is unique. There's only one as a king, and he was approved by the Byzantines because at the time he was the only Germanic king who didn't convert to the Arian faith. He converted to Orthodoxy. So there was this very interesting role, and Byzantium even had no problem with Clovis crushing some Western Roman pockets, like the Kingdom of Soissons, stuff like this. So you have this these two entities working together, with one acknowledging that the other is the empire and one acknowledging that the other is a kingdom. So you still have the Merovingian respected this idea of, even though they wanted conquest, even though they took land, they still respected this idea of Romanity.
Yes.
They wanted to be Roman by respecting also the empire. And the real shift is a bit later on. With the Carolingians. I mean, we're gonna cover that right now. Do you have anything to add on the Merovingians? It's a very interesting part of history. It's
no, I don't. I'm glad actually to know that that during that period there's a more Orthodox expression. So that's actually new to me. I mean, you had been saying this, but and I trust your research on it, but it's not something that I know a whole lot about. I had studied and looked at the practices of this period. I'm speaking primarily of where the Frankish practices might have originated, with the old Teutonic practices of body division, of blood drinking, blood relics, these things, and even making your own warriors into beef jerky. I'm not joking, by the way. Yeah. Why would this practice have developed? Well, I think that you could look at the idea of blood piety as something associated with a perversion of Christian ideas. And in fact, the same notion of the body division, the cutting it up and sending it out in different parts and this kind of stuff, which is actually condemned by one of the popes later on. I think that it's like a perversion of the ideas that are in the church. It's a sort of a crass literalization. And the reason I bring all that up is that it fits exactly into the topics that we've discussed in the past, you and I, where we talked about the Jesuit usage of Sacred Heart. I think this is where they will get this idea, right? This practice of the notion of, well, the heart is the nobler part in the man. Perhaps they've even misunderstood older devotions about the prayer of the heart as if it's literalized, right? And we have the same weird manifestations in the female Roman Catholic quote unquote saints who, you know, think that they're inscribed with things. I was re-listening to an old interview I did, and there's a reference to the Book of Golden Legends, which is one of these fantastical accounts during this the Frankish period, where, like the Song of Roland, you have all these legends and stuff. And somebody actually had something like they cut open the body and there was golden letters written on the heart or something like that, which was being used to justify the practice of heart burial and this kind of, which is a magical practice, basically an older Teutonic magical practice. And the thesis could be that, well, it's an automatic path to sainthood, right? So you have this notion of incorruptibles in the church. And these are all just weird kind of perversions of that, where simpler-minded people, barbarian-minded people, might have been taking things like the idea that the elite have higher levels of their blue bloods, basically. The elite blood is special. Oh, look at the church is doing, like, you know, drinking the blood of Christ. Well, if the elites are a higher, nobler, you know, then we should be drinking the blood of our warriors who went out before us, you know, in battle or something like this. These are pretty, I think, plausible approaches to how those weird devotions, excesses, fetishes developed. And what's interesting is that it doesn't exist in the East. You don't have heart burial. You don't have heart worship. You don't have any of this stuff, which is why we view it as Nestorian. Yeah.
To close off on the Merovingians, I'm just going to add that this is not a theory, it's practiced by our clergy. And when I talked to this with Father Filioque, he said to me that, as you know, we do prayers for the kings of old and the current rulers during the liturgy. And he says that it is a practice in France to pray for all the Merovingian dynasty, basically.
Oh, wow.
So during liturgy, this is a common practice. It's absolutely not a problem. That's something we do. We draw the line at the carolingians.
Now, when we get into the Carolingians, we have the first instances, as I mentioned, of the claims of making our warriors into beef jerky. We boil the warriors and we cut them up and we send their salted body parts out to other areas. And this is, as I understand, the first claim for a blood relic is Charlemagne in let's see, I wrote it down somewhere. 806, Charlemagne claims to have found a blood relic. And so this whole idea, which, by the way, is still kind of a thing in the Roman Catholic world, where, oh, look, this Eucharist, it just started bleeding, and let's test the DNA to see if it's the blood of Jesus. Oh, maybe it is. All of which is ludicrous, but this is where this starts to happen. I know we're not talking about the heart burial stuff, but it is relevant because these are clear manifestations of a different theology than what's in Byzantium.
Yes, there's a great shift, and it starts not with Charlemagne. It starts with his father, Pepin the Short. So basically, what you need to understand is that at the time, the Merovingian world, the kings don't rule that much. And there's this office called the Mayor of the Palace. And the Mayor of the Palace, starting with Charles Martel, for example, started to take more and more power. And at some point, they just overthrew the Merovingians. And that's when you have the Carolingian dynasty. The first one who has this transition is Pepin the Short. And what's very interesting is that the Carolingians understood that they didn't have the same understanding of empire. They wanted to be the new empire.
Right.
So, and they knew that in order to legitimize the empire, you need to go through religion. And for example, when you look at early church, it goes with having good relations with clergy, major clergy, and it goes with having promoting a new dogma. And we can see that Pepin is going to invade Italy, which at the time was in the hand of the Arian Lombards, and create a state for the papacy. So this is the first breach. So the Pope, who was living under heretical rule, which is fine, we can have this. The Orthodox Bishop of Rome is propelled into this world of politics with the donation of Pepin. So that's in 754. And this is the first act of trying to make the papacy politic, trying to make the papal states. And by the way, at some point, the papal states believed that this was a rule given to them by Constantine, with the donation of Constantine, but we're going to cover that a forgery, obviously. So this is one of the first problems we see, the first subversion. You have this new kingdom wanting to be an empire, and they're using hierarchs that they didn't interact with so much. Something very interesting, out of all the French kings, only 2 were crowned in Rome by the Pope, and only 1 as the king of the Franks, which was Pepin. Otherwise, it was always done in Reims, where Clovis was back.
So here we have the like you said, this is where the papacy begins. The papacy begins to be caught in the middle of this problem. And this is where the Filioque will come into play as a means or a justification for re-evangelizing and changing the Orthodox East from the vantage point of the Franks.
Exactly. So we talked about Pepin and his son, who really establishes himself as king of the Franks. First of all, finishes the work of Pepin by being crowned emperor. So that's in 800. So he uses the fact that at the time the Byzantine Empire was ruled by a woman. So with a technicality, he used political influence he had on the Pope, and he got crowned emperor. So you have a shift right now. That's when you have new terms appearing. For example, the Greeks. We were never called the Greeks; they were called the Romans.
Romans, yeah, right.
Yeah. Right now, it's the Greeks. The Franks start to delegitimize the East. So they start to become an empire. And how do you solidify your status as a holy emperor? With a new dogma.
Change to the creed.
Yeah. So this change of the creed was made by the Frankish theologians. It's something very interesting. So that's the Council of Aachen. And that's the synod where it's really attested. And they start to create all legends about it. And Siecienski is very good at noticing this. That,
yes.
To this day, people would say, "Oh, actually, it was somewhere in Spain, and to fight the Arians, we needed to add something," which is ridiculous. We don't become Monophysite to fight the Nestorians. But never mind. So they start to create this legend about these Spanish councils, Iberian councils, trying to damn the Arians, just kill the Arians over and over, and establish a true faith. And what Siecienski notices is that it's not really true. We have no real attestation of the Council of Toledo really being this damnation for the Arians, but we have proof that it started in Aachen. Like we can see that we can see it in Aachen, even if there were Visigothic influence in France. And something that's especially interesting is that the Franks themselves, through forgeries and stuff, will try to legitimize the status of the Filioque themselves and against the papacy for a while. So after the Synod of Aachen, you have Pope Leo III, which is the same one that crowned him, who posts silver shields with the creed on it, saying you cannot change a creed, and makes direct equivalencies between the Greek and the Latin. One shield was in Greek, another was in Latin. So no question about, oh, it's just language, we don't understand one another. No, it was clear. We had hundreds of years to sort it out. And Charlemagne tries to legitimize all this against the Byzantine Empire. And something that Siecienski misses is that in Gregory of Tours, with the author of the same book we've just mentioned, the book starts with a creed, a reading of the creed. And if you have the Penguin edition, as I do, you will see that it says the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And if you go to Min, to the PL, Patrologia Latina, you will see that there's a footnote that literally says, oh, we can find this in every manuscript since this Frankish codex. This is Frankish codex from the Somme, which is the same place that we also believe the Athanasian Creed, which is another famous forgery, come from. And Min literally states this. It tries to preemptively says, oh, don't worry, it was added, but it's fine, and it's in order to honor the councils of Spain, the Council of Toledo, Isidore of Seville, and stuff like this. So there's this whole legitimization of this. But in the book that talks about the history of the Franks, they had to modify it themselves.
Yeah,
that's something crazy. We found it. It's in the book. I know it's not yet in George's book, but we found it on an old Discord thanks to our team. People who know Latin, Greek. So yeah.
Let me. There's a section I want to read just a little bit from the Philippides book on this, where he says, with the Lateran Synod, the Pope had aspired to incorporate the Franks into the Orthodox camp. By offering them for the first time the honor of participating in the Synod, he hoped to keep them more committed to him in view of the future Longobards expansionist aims. However, history proved him wrong. The Franks soon afterwards embarked on their own expansionist wars without showing any respect towards Orthodoxy or the Romans. Nevertheless, this synod also had a secondary significance. One of its important decisions was the unconditional support for the veneration of icons. In fact, the epistles of the patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were in favor of icon veneration, and they were read and recited during the synod. At the same time, however, as in every synod, the confirmation of acceptance of the decisions preceding the ecumenical synods was repeated. It was underlined that the correct faith is defined only by the ecumenical synods, and the symbol of faith was also recited. The Frankish bishops unanimously agreed with all these decisions and declarations. The Christian church continued to be united and indivisible up into 770 AD, with the exception of Constantinople's error on the side of iconomachy. However, scarcely 20 years had gone by when the Franks changed their stance altogether and rejected everything that they had accepted during the Lateran Synod. They disregarded the unalterable status of the symbol, the creed, by adding Filioque. They rejected the exclusivity of the ecumenical synods for defining dogma by officially recognizing the arbitrariness of every secular leader or the Pope, something that had led the Latin Church into an authoritarian adventures in the centuries that would follow. They also rejected the veneration of icons, even after Constantinople had reverted back to orthodoxy and the veneration of icons. Having embarked on such actions, they began ever since to assert, and they continue to do so, that they were the ones who had preserved the true Christian faith, as opposed to the Byzantines, whom they systematically referred to. They systematically continued to slander for many centuries with their contra erroris Graecorum, the forgeries, right? As we've shown, that whole document is a bunch of forgeries. And then I'm almost done. He goes on to say, despite the contrary opinion adopted by some historians, it was not the icon fighters that caused the religious conflicts between the Franks and the empire. A few years after the Lateran Synod, the situation changed in Constantinople, and an iconophile empress, Irene, convened the Seventh Synod. As we know, the Synod fully restored the veneration of icons. And what was the Franks' reaction to this? Instead of hailing the return of heretical Greeks to the Orthodox faith, they composed a reply against the heretical synod and rejected Nicaea too. This was the time when Charlemagne's military successes gave birth to the dreams of a domination of the world by the Frankish court. Indeed, the Franks now felt powerful enough to cast aside every pretense. They were not in the least interested in any Orthodox faith or even the condemnation of the iconoclasts in 769. This meant nothing more than a means of conquering Italy. They were not even interested in the Pope as long as he held a different opinion. When Pope Hadrian received the capitulare, it must have shocked them. He would not have even expected this kind of a reaction, given that his representatives participated in the Seventh Ecumenical Council and his epistles have been recorded in the Synod's minutes. And even Patriarch Theresias himself had pointed out how exceptionally focused Adrian was on the ancient traditions of the Universal Apostolic Church. He immediately issued a reply, I'm almost done, known as the Hadrianum, and sent it to Charlemagne. In it, he refuted point by point all of the Frankish mistakes, adhering to the Orthodox decisions of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Charlemagne, however, had already made his mind up on these issues. Instead of accepting the Pope's clarifications and rejoicing, as the Orthodox normally do to this very day about the Seventh Ecumenical Council, with the Synodicon of Orthodoxy and the Sunday of Orthodoxy over the victory of the icons, which decision was signed by all the 5 patriarchates. Instead, Charlemagne instructed his theological advisors to compose a new theology, and this is how we get the renowned Libri Carolini, which came to be and expressed the Frankish theological positions opposed to the Orthodox ones, both the Orthodox view of Rome and the Orthodox view of Constantinople.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Something very interesting that, so you see that the Franks, they don't really care about theology. What they care about is not being the empire, and they don't care about the papacy. And what's very funny is that today people will defend this Frankish dogma.
Especially the trads, exactly.
Yeah, you are defending the people who subverted Rome way before Vatican II.
Yes, exactly. That's wow, the irony, exactly.
Yeah, and we are defending what Rome used to be in all its glory, and this they were not genuine, and it's demonstrated best of all by Theodore Phofolians, who in the Libri Carolini fought against icons, who said we cannot have icons in churches. In his own church in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, you can see to this day, commissioned by him, there's even a note in Latin says that he commissioned it, a mosaic, a Byzantine mosaic inside the church of the angels and the Ark of the Covenant. We're going to show it on screen. So he himself didn't care, to the point that he will write that it's a heresy, and he commissioned it. And this was destructive to the West, because the West used to have a very nice iconographic tradition. If you look at early churches, even Carolingian churches, it's very Byzantine. It's the same beautiful tradition of icons that you are trying to reappropriate today as a Roman Catholic. And it was destroyed by this, because since there was no real position on icons, there was no real position on how to regulate icons. There was no real position. What can we make an icon? What is canonical? What is and then you've got these very gory statues coming in. It's nothing like the original Romanesque art that you have.
Yeah, the Seventh Council was very interested in not letting pagan art come into the church, and that's why they're developed a very precise way of doing the iconography. Which is not to say that there's not some area of divergence. Obviously, certain churches have a little more of a 3-dimensional representation in their iconography as opposed to others. The point is not to be pharisaical. The point was rather to set some guidelines and some hedges so that you don't let the really weird, crazy stuff creep in, like you get in the Renaissance with nude bodies and basically X-rated type stuff going on. I won't use all those terms for YouTube, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah, we've covered this in the past.
Exactly, it was destructive for tradition, and not only was it destructive directly, it was a time bomb. This Libri Carolini was a time bomb. So today you have people arguing against the Protestant for being iconoclast. Why are they iconoclastic? Because during the Reformation, the reformers who studied tradition, namely Calvin, looked at the Libri Carolini. Mm-hmm. And he says that he approved councils, but he says that he cannot approve the Seventh Council. So if the Protestants were destroying Roman Catholic churches during the Reformation, it is because of these kind of errors that were perpetrated through the Libri Carolini. And by the way, Theodore Phofolians is a Roman Catholic saint. Mm. So he planted the seeds.
The seeds of the Reformation are there, yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, that's wow.
Yeah, if you're very with Mary statues today, very weird Pachamama stuff. It's because of this, because there was no limit set on the icons. And if you have Protestant iconoclast, it's because of this as well. Because the West didn't really respect the seventh council, and they're still trying to basically both problems stem from the same thing, and you can trace it back to Theodore Phofolians.
Well, it would be very hard to reconcile accepting the Seventh Ecumenical Council given the political position that you're trying to set up. I mean, how are you going to accept the Seventh Ecumenical Council when it says that the Orthodox emperor in Byzantium is the God-ordained emperor, and you're trying to set up a separate empire? So how are you going to, I mean, obviously the political machinations are the reasons why. They don't care about the theology. That's why they don't want to accept it. And so if they did accept it, then they would presumably also have to accept the legitimacy of the Orthodox Imperium.
Correct. Exactly.
So yeah, so the theology is a tool here for the justification of the geopolitical moves that are being made. So here's where we get the declaration, Holy Roman Empire. This is where it begins to be viewed as its own thing, where, oh, I'm the emperor of the West, by the way. And you get the reversal on the creed. Let's not forget that there's a reversal here. It's like, oh, no, we shouldn't have the Filioque. Oh, wait, but yes, actually we should. It's good. As we said, the papacy gets caught in the middle. Let's see, there's one. Oh, this is what I wanted to note about Siecienski was that exactly, I didn't expect him actually to comment on this. I wouldn't have thought he would be as keyed into this, and maybe he wasn't aware of the Frankish Thesis, but he seems to have just basically vindicated. He says, yes, this is clearly an innovation. It's clearly something that had political motivations. It's clearly a new faith that you need to evangelize for. And he says, he uses the phrase that it was a declaration of independence from Byzantium. So if you're going to accept these previous ecumenical councils as expressions of the Orthodox faith of the ecumene, and everybody admits the Seventh Synod is a valid synod, except for Calvin, then how are we going to justify all this? It doesn't make any sense, right? So we get not only a new faith, you get a new emperor, a new faith, new emperor, right? They go together, and Siecienski vindicates this in his Filioque book. So what that means, by the way, is that this is not merely a crazy theory of Romanides, right? It has nothing to do with Romanides. Romanides can be right or wrong on an issue, irrespective of the rest of his theology. On this issue, he's correct. Doesn't mean he's right about everything, right? Again, Siecienski has no interest in vindicating Romanides, but the book is making that point that, yes, this is clearly politically motivated and a divergence from the apostolic faith prior to it. And trads should understand this. Trads should grasp this. You want to be traditional? You should be Orthodox. Because as Snek said, it's the Carolingians that are the innovators here. They're subverting the Pope. Don't you see?
Yeah, clearly the Carolingian didn't get the memo and papal supremacy.
Papal supremacy, right? Exactly.
Yeah, apparently not.
But my base, Charlemagne,
Yeah, killing Saxons and stuff. Yeah, but really, you know, what we call the Frankish Thesis at this point, the revisionists are not really in all ranks. The only people who really start to think there's a continuity between, you know, from Peter to Augustine to Charlemagne to whatever the papacy is today, is a trads. They are the one being the revisionists. So we talked about this. So first of all clergy accepts it, and the academic consensus goes this way too. So we actually talked to Professor Alibert, who is a PhD in the Catholic Institute of Paris, and who wrote a thesis on the Liber Carolini.
Oh, wow.
And he said that, so we had someone from our server and talked to him, and he explained that in his original thesis, he started to talk about real legitimate theological controversies about iconoclasm and stuff. But he said that he revised his position, that clearly the main factor here is not truth or faith or conserving the church from the Franks. It's political.
Yes,
clearly.
Exactly. And Siecienski backs that up. who is not writing a book to defend the Filioque. He's writing a book to academically just simply look at the debate from both sides the whole time. Also worth mentioning here, something I had forgotten in reviewing my old notes. This is where, quote, Christendom first begins to be mentioned. It's a Carolingian invention. And one thing that they did that James Kelly mentions is that they would take liturgical books that the East used and they would change them and doctor them. And so like you get for the coronation of people in the West, you start to get these new phrases about the emperor is now the ruler of all of the Holy Roman Empire, which is Christendom. And you get, for example, in Charles V, the coronation ceremony, which speaks of him in a Nestorian way, very interesting, because this will tie into Nestorian, the heart burial and heart worship, Sacred Heart issue. You get the idea that the ruler is free from all sin, as are his noble court. This is used, apparently, in the coronation ceremony. I don't know if you've heard of Kantorowicz and the two bodies of the king, but that's where this plays into this, because there's this weird development that happens at this time period where there's two notions of the body of Christ. There's the body that is the sort of the liturgical church body, and then there's this body that's this other body that's like the king and his court and this kind of stuff. So this idea will actually be present here with, I think, the Franks. And even the papacy also. The papacy will also kind of have this notion, because they're going to develop a notion of the magisterial body, which is different from the mystical body. And if you want a short introduction to that, actually Sherrard has a good summation of this analysis in Church, Papacy, and Schism. He has a whole chapter on the development of the two bodies within the magisterium of the church in the Latin view. This is Nestorian. I'm sorry, but there's one mystical body. There's not a juridical magisterial body that's of a higher ontological status than the mystical body of the layman, right, and the priests. But if you have the papal mindset, you can start to see why you would get this magisterial body that is separate and unique, separate from the mystical sacramental body of the church. Again, Nestorian presuppositions that are pretty consistent here, because if you have the correct Christology, you're going to have the correct ecclesiology. But what we're starting to see is a divergence, not just in the Frankish theology of the Imperium and icons, but there's also going to begin to be divergences Christologically here, which a lot of people miss. And that's, I think, what Kantorowicz is trying to hone in on in his famous book, The Two Bodies of the King.
Yeah, and of course, everything's linked. You know, if you introduce a Filioque,
Right.
it's going to introduce Christological problems, it's going to introduce Trinitarian problems, it's going to create other stuff. And yes, this idea of, you know, the duality being introduced to the body of Christ, of course, is Nestorian, and it's still being used to this day to justify many things. You know, the Pope can be worshipping Pachamama by day, but he can still be infallible if he, you know, if he fills some specific conditions. So he can be a total formal heretic, and then at the same time we can be, you know, real Pope. You know, formal Pope, real Pope, the two natures of the Pope.
Yes, exactly. The same mistake is present here, where we can separate the actual occupant of the office from the office, right? And this allows for all manner of sophistry with, well, I'm a set of probationists, where he is a valid pope, but the charism of Peter is withheld because of his heresies, and so I can reject everything he says, even though he's still the pope. I mean, and all the infinite variations, right? From that all the way over to the Novus Ordo. Well, I accept, but I reject everything that Francis teaches, but I accept him as a pope, right? So I'm going to separate him as the representative of Christ, the body, but the head of the church, but not his teaching, right? So you can make all these separations, and there's no notion of the sacramental and clerical unity in the church, right? What does Irenaeus say, right? What does St. Ignatius say? Where the bishop is, there's the church. There's no higher magisterial strata of super bishops in Rome.
Yeah, and this idea, you know, people need to be impeccable. The Pope can be, you know, a total sinner. He doesn't need to be impeccable. He doesn't need to strive for this. Paul, in Timothy sets a lot of rules for the bishop. The bishop needs to be decent enough to be acclaimed by the people. That's why we have the axios thing. So yeah, moving on. Franks. So you have this moment in history where Rome is starting to being subverted by the Frankish Church, and this is during that's where the Photian crisis happens. So first of all,
in my notes I have, let's see, there's a certain point when they start putting cousins into the office of the papacy. We might not be there yet. You know what I'm talking about?
That's an interesting thing. You have popes that start to promote the Filioque and fight against the Byzantines. So you have, for example, Nicholas I, who was really opposed to Photios and makes the first Photian synod, anti-Photian synod. For example, it's 869.
Okay.
That anathematizes Photios, which is, so for the Roman Catholic, it's the 8th council, basically.
Okay.
And then you have popes coming back, from the Byzantine faction, who will actually say, no, Photios is right, and the Photian synod of 879 is actually the ecumenical council. It's accepted. The Council of Nicholas avoid. That's what you can see at the Declaration of Photios. That's what Vonik talks about, and you see this fight inside Rome. So Rome starts to be eaten from the inside, and that's a big problem. And that's during the 14th century. That's why 10 years apart you have two decisions regarding the creed, regarding faith, that should be infallible, that contradict one another from the Pope. At the same time, when you have problems regarding how to evangelize, how do we evangelize, for example, Bulgaria? Bulgaria recently converted. Yeah. Who should evangelize it? The Franks? Or tomorrow in the old calendar, we're going to celebrate St. Cyril and Methodius, or the Byzantine. So the Byzantine are sending people from Thessaloniki to evangelize. And there's this scare.
No, I thought John Chrysostom converted the Bulgarians.
We're going to talk about this when
I know, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So Cyril and Methodius are being sent to evangelize these people. And I don't remember which pope, but there's a pope that says that it's a good thing that Byzantium actually does this work, because they're afraid that the Filioque would propagate to Bulgaria. So, and there are many clashes with the Frankish evangelizers.
And remember, this is vindicated in the letters of Photios, which are not in English. The only place that I've seen this is if you look in the Dragas article that I have linked below. He has translations that some of the professors in Greece have done, the letters of Photios, where he bitches about the Franks evangelizing amongst the already Orthodox Bulgarians for the Filioque.
Yeah, exactly. And Cyril at some point is captured by the Franks. So Saint Cyril, who is a Catholic saint as well, Saint Cyril and Methodius. Yeah. I think the Pope said that they're the saints of Europe.
Right.
Your church, the Frankish church that you are defending now, attacked them for evangelizing Europe. So yeah, that's another great thing. And then they will tell you that we can't evangelize.
And also another dumb low IQ response to this is that some people will say, oh, that's not talking about Charlemagne. That's talking about the term Franks was used by everybody in the West. No, it's specifically talking about the Carolingian dynasty. Read the Dragas article. It makes it very clear. It's not talking about all the West.
Exactly. So you have one more controversy of the Filioque. One is the first Filioque. There was a Filioque crisis in the West, and then it's starting to clash with the East. So you have this new church developing and subverting Rome. The Franks are doing this. They are placing cousins. They are playing politics in Rome, and Rome already has been pushed into this role of politics by Pepin, by being the Papal States, by making the Pope a king. So they're caught in the middle of this, and that's during the whole crisis. And yes, Franks, it means specifically the Carolingian, not all of the Latin. Right. Photios talks about it. This is not a conspiracy.
Exactly, and so by the 11th century, it looks like the takeover of the papal throne is pretty much complete. We've got cousins of the Carolingians being stuck in there, just like later on the Borgias will have, you know, their family as the pope. But at this point, it's the Franks are controlling, and this is where presumably, you know, we start to get Avignon captivity.
It's a bit later,
Okay.
but it's a bit more complicated.
So they've already got the while the papacy is still in Rome, they've already gotten control of it. Is that right? I mean, yeah. So the throne of Peter is still in Italy, and they have control of it by the 11th century. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yeah. So the Holy Roman Empire gets formed by Otto I, and then a subsequent German emperor. During his coronation ceremony, which happened in Rome, during the coronation ceremony, he makes the Filioque being sung in Rome for the first time. So that's
okay.
That's 1014, if I remember properly. And of course, the Pope was removed. You know, there was this tradition of the German kings, new German emperor, moving to Italy, making a military campaign in Italy, sacking some Italian cities. And then getting crowned in Rome, and you know, removing the previous pope, putting a friendly one, and getting themselves crowned, and then you have that's where the Great Schism starts to kick in. So after 1014, the creed is instated in Rome, despite what Pope John VIII.
Yes, this is where we get to the controversy over how to say it right.
That's a Great Schism that's happening right after this, and
right.
And of course, all of this was propped up by forgeries, and the Great Schism is something that happened because of forgeries as well. You know, the false decretals, donation of Constantine, all these false works of the fathers that we're going to see popping up again. All of this is propped up by forgeries that were made primarily by the Franks. So now, the tools that were used by the Franks to martyr Rome, Orthodox Rome, they are being used against the Byzantines by Rome. And that's what we need to understand, that Rome was the first martyr of this church as Orthodox. We do not hate Rome. We do not even hate the Franks, because the Merovingians were fine. But we need to understand that where the problem comes from. And that's why you have the Great Schism. And again, the Great Schism happened for three reasons. One, because we used leavened bread. Second, because we had married priesthood. And third, because we supposedly removed the Filioque from the creed. All of this today, they are either accepted by the Pope or historically false. Today, the papacy accepts married clergy, they accept leavened bread, and they recognize that the creed wasn't altered by the Greeks. So the three reasons for schism were wrong, and it was done under one authority. It wasn't done under Matthew 16:18 Dyer. It was done under the authority of the donation of Constantine. So it was done for three wrong reasons from a wrong authority, in contradiction to previous popes. You are, like Roman Catholics, you are not on the good side of the schism here, given the reasons you bring up. So that's a Great Schism, and that's where Rome is completely cut off from the West. So in the West now you have two major players. You have the Emperor and the Pope, and what's happening very quick, and that's called the episode of Canossa, is that the Emperor still wants to control the papacy. But the Pope excommunicates the Emperor. It was Henry IV, Emperor Heinrich IV. So the Pope excommunicates the Emperor, threatens a civil war, and humiliates the Emperor, and starts to prop himself as the one who decides who needs to be the Emperor. So now that it's just a battle royale between the Frankish kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire, and subverted Rome, they're fighting one another. And that's where you have all this idea of the papacy fighting against the monarchs, being above the monarchs, fighting against Caesar papism. You know,
papalo-Caesarism is what. So
Yeah.
they always fuss about Caesaro-papism, but now we're getting the papalo-Caesarism.
And they fight against this, but the Filioque is the quintessential
Exactly.
Caesar-papist dogma. And even with the extended
right, this is because the state is who really pushed this to be added, right?
Yeah. So now you have them fighting over this. You have them trying to defend this, and of course the emperor is humiliated. He needs to be half naked in the snow, and that's where you have the papacy trying to reform itself. So against the Byzantines and against the Germans, and that's where you have the introduction of cardinals. That's where you have the post-schism papal freakout, where they move away from patristics to justify the system, and they go into scholastics.
Yes,
that's what we continue.
There we go. Good point.
Yeah.
Right. So we wouldn't even have the scholastic manifestation as it happened in the West if there wasn't this prior attempt to divorce from the Byzantine heritage.
Yeah, and that's a great thing. Right now, theological arguments are not based on traditions. They're not based on the fathers. They're based mainly on forgeries. If anything, patristics still reside in the West, but they are made based on philosophical argument, and you can justify anything with philosophical argument.
Yeah, this is why when you're interacting with the trads that you're arguing with, most of the time, 99% of the time, they don't know anything about the first millennium, right? They're always just rehashing stuff from, Anselm, Aquinas, second millennium people. They're not proficient when it comes to the first millennium, and so they just assume that all of that was ironed out, and so I don't even have to go back to the first millennium. I can just look at whatever Aquinas said because he got it right. Oh, really? So when he relies on against the errors of the Greeks, how useful is that when it's full of forgeries? So all of that wisdom of Aquinas, how come it didn't help him to, see that this was a document full of forgeries? He's your angelic doctor. The angels didn't whisper in his ear, "Psst, that document is a bunch of forgeries." I mean, I see pictures in Roman Catholic churches of Thomas Aquinas with a book and a pen and angels whispering into his ear, but the angels couldn't tell him. He's relying on a book full of forgeries.
Yeah, that's what we've seen with George and the library of forgeries. Most of what Aquinas quotes from church fathers, they are forgeries. We've had a good laugh today. We found one where Aquinas quotes St. John Chrysostom, who died who was a 5th century father. Yeah. St. John Chrysostom sending talking to an emissary of the Bulgars will appear for several centuries later, and like the time traveling Bulgars probably. And like, how did they notice this? And
they had a DeLorean. They knew Doc Brown, Marty, right? So they got in the DeLorean with Marty McFly, and they flew back and talked to John Chrysostom, and then they went back to their century.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't make a good knife with bad iron, and that's a big problem. Aquinas relies on forgeries. He relies on philosophical systems that are foreign to Christian thinking, and you can justify anything you want. So now you have this papacy in this West that try to justify itself against the East, as the Franks did. So they're playing the part that the Franks did, and they're using scholasticism. They're using all these new systems, and they are moving away. And that's why, if you talk to people from the Roman Catholic Church, they will defend probably Renaissance aesthetics, they will defend scholastic thinking, and they will defend Vatican I ultramontanism. But early church really rarely. They will sometimes find a quote from a pope, or someone talking about the pope in good terms, which non sequitur means that he's the emperor of the universe, and that's a big problem. And I wanted to come back on the idea of royalty of the kingdom, of royal sainthood, which we established is traditional. That's the moment where you start to see less and less saintly kings, because the pope needs to erode the power of the king, the power of the emperor. You have people who start saying, the councils weren't really called by the emperors; they were called by the pope mostly. Even if he didn't attend, even when he wasn't invited, like in the Second Council of Constantinople, you have people like Baronius using.
he called it, but he wasn't invited.
Yeah, not even legates came to the second council in Constantinople. So eroding this idea, eroding the fifth council where the Pope was actually defrocked and then reinstated, eroding the sixth council because Honorius was excommunicated for heresy, all of these things, and eroding the power of the kings. So we've come to this realization talking to many French monarchists, and at some point people were asking themselves, oh, we're Catholic because it's a default religion in France, and what's happening when the Pope doesn't agree? And that's what happened all the time. The popes fought against this idea of the king being the representative of the people. They started to establish what's called the interdict, ecclesiastical interdiction, meaning that no sacrament will be valid in the entire country for decades at times. That's what happened in France for quite a while. There's a moment where you see saints, royal sainthood dwindling. In France, for example, there's only one king that's a saint. It's Louis IX, Saint Louis, because he made a crusade, and he wasn't really a saint for his personal piety. He was a saint for his ability to be the sword of the Pope. And that's absolutely not what we see in early history. For example, in France,
that's a great point. That's a great point.
You see kings that embody their people and then go to monastery. And for example, we have, I think 2 days ago, we celebrated the synod of all the Russian monarchs who were sainted. There were 160, because all of these little principalities, they had these people who went to monastery and tried to be pious and stuff like this. And now it's completely disappearing. You have probably King Kazimierz Jagiellon in Poland, but this idea of royal sainthood dwindles, this idea of link to the people dwindles, and now the Pope.
Yes, and so here we go. If we screw up the doctrine of the Symphonia, that's correct, which is what happens at this time period that we're looking at. Not only do we get the theology all messed up, we get the theology of the state messed up, and then we begin to lose the notion of the sanctity of the state, that the state has a role as a diakonos, minister of God. And so then it becomes a political thing, like we're talking about with, an arm of the Crusades. That's not the point of the state. But the Orthodox tradition continues this notion of the role of the state. Loosely, it's there in the West, but it's kind of confused because they don't really have the Symphonia view, because eventually the rise of the papacy, the Pope becomes both. He becomes the head of church and state. But it's not that way in the East, because the East is the continuation of the Byzantine idea, obviously, clearly, right? Even in the symbology of the double-headed eagle, right? That's lost. I mean, the Holy Roman Empire continues that symbology, but the whole idea of it's gone because the papacy becomes, again, the head of church and state. So what happens is that you can see the natural progression of, well, if you mess up the relationship of church and state and Symphonia, then what's eventually going to happen is you're going to lose the idea of a Christian state or nation. And shocker, that's what happens in the West. Both the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches of the West, even though initially, let's say the time of the Reformation, both of those churches had a conception of a Christian state. Even the German princes allied with Luther, and even to a degree Calvin, had a conception of some kind of Christian notion of the state. However, a few centuries down the road, when all this Western theology degenerates on both sides, the Roman Catholic and the Protestant, shocker, secular state in the whole West, secular state. Total loss of the notion of the sacramental idea of the state.
Exactly. So, first of all, in the first place, it justifies, political Protestantism. People want to distantiate themselves from the Holy Roman Emperor. People want to distantiate themselves from the papacy. People want to, dismantle the monasteries. Political Protestantism is motivated because if you're not the ally of the Pope will ruin your state. The Pope will damn your population, your people that you're supposed to tend for. The Pope will, control your clergy, control your administration. of course, you have people who rebel against this, even under persecution, and probably overreach of the state in Russia during the reforms of Peter the Great.
Sure,
the church didn't do this. Yeah, and that's where political Protestantism comes in. And how do we respond to political Protestantism? With more papal supremacy, with more and more papal supremacy, with persecution of the Protestant.
Exactly right.
It ends up with Vatican I, and Vatican I says, oh, I'm the king of the universe. I have my ordinary magisterium extends to all Christians on matters of discipline, on matters of stuff, and if you don't follow it, you're losing faith and salvation. This is Vatican I, Pastor Aetonis. And of course, if you're a head of state and you see this, you're going to secularize. It took only 35 years for France, which is a country that since its inception had historically a clergy-dominated administration. Even under Napoleon, reinstated many clergymen into his institution, even right after his revolution. It took only 35 years from Vatican I to the total law of secularization of the state in France. It's a direct consequence. And you see it everywhere. So yes, this is an overreach. This is a destruction of the balance that you're supposed to see between church and state. I'm not saying that Russia is perfect. It's a web used from the Tsars as well. But people lost this notion. And people lost this notion of the king, of the head of state as a representative. People lost this notion of royal sainthood. There are very few royal saints late in the Catholic era. Of course, you have women royal saints because, this idea of woman worship and very effeminate worship and
the histrionics,
ideas of emotional worship, stuff about femininity, submission to the Pope and the Church and stuff like this. So you lose this idea of also virility. You lose this idea of virility. You lose this idea of sainthood, and this has been devastating for the West. I'm not saying that the East is doing well, but you can still see it today politically through what kind of charisma people try to embody in the political spheres in the East, probably.
Okay, so what's next? Is there more? Do you want to talk about one thing I wanted to throw in that I looked back on my old notes was I didn't remember this. So apparently in 1299, Pope Boniface VIII issued a encyclical Detestande Veritatis, which excommunicated any of the princes for heart worship, body division, or the kinds of practices that the Franks were known for doing. So that's a vindication of the fact that this really was going on. Now, I know we're not here to talk today about heart worship, but I went back and I was reading through my notes on the Frankish period and the rise of the Sacred Heart practice and devotion from heart worship and blood relics, blood piety, which is all kind of superstitious type stuff. And this relates to many of the streams that Snek and I've done in the past where we talked about these superstitious devotions and weird practices. They still continue and into the period when the Jesuits start, utilizing it for so-called anti-Protestant Counter-Reformation usages. But what this suggests that's interesting that I'd forgotten is that in Orthodox conception, the body is holy. So we have the notion, of not embalming, of not doing cremation. And there's this problem even in how to view the body between the papacy that was even still adhering to the older tradition because Boniface VIII is rejecting this. And then Clement V is installed, who is one of the relatives of, because so Philip the Fair kidnaps Boniface VIII, beats him up, and then Clement V is, after a brief period, is installed, Avignon papacy, and then he okays heart burial and heart worship. So you have another change. It basically says to the court, yes, if you want to do these practices, you can. So again, we see that putting people into the office of the papacy for political power and motivation is clearly what's going on here. And that shows...
The Avignon papacy, that's the whole point. The Avignon papacy is basically what Pepin tried to do with the papal state. It's, okay, so the Holy Roman Empire was getting destroyed from within because of its political institution, and it's linked with a foreign papacy. So basically, the Avignon papacy was a French, the Kingdom of France, which separated. Try to control the papacy, and of course it's politically motivated. Philippe le Bel, Philippe the Fair, apparently didn't really care about papal supremacy and so on. When he literally sent a commander to beat up the Pope and instituted this. So yes, that continued to be used for politically motivated use, and we see it until very late.
And this is it's in the scholarly research. For example, there's a paper that I'll try to remember to link it below. It's called "Authority, Family, and the Dead in Late Medieval France" by Elizabeth Brown, and she has a whole abstract, a whole thesis on Boniface VIII, the view of the body, and the debates that were going on at this time about heart worship and heart burial. So that's not a conspiracy theory. It's just mainline scholarship. If you want to look that up.
You see today, they have this weird understanding that incorrupt body means Snow White. You need to be in this glass.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We talked about that before with the Orthodox incorruptibles, and then the Roman Catholic version of it.
So what we found is that popes, as soon as Pope died, they tried to remove any cancer they had and so on. They just remove all the extra stuff. They drain all the blood. They fill everything with plastic. Right. They try to
embalming, right?
Yeah, and they make an anti-UV coffin. And they even use a wax mask from Madame Tussauds. Actually, that's very interesting. So yeah, and that's shocking, because you see, like, traditional incorruption, you can still see it in the early Renaissance in Rome. You can still see that the skin still blackened. Everybody is touched by.
And by the way, yes, keep in mind, De Testande Veritatis and the continued. So this notion in the West even continued after this period, because at the time of the Freemasonic controversies, when the popes began writing encyclicals against Freemasonry, they would argue against the Freemasonic doctrine of cremation. So there's a whole slew of anti-Masonic encyclicals, I think, from the 1700s all the way up. And oftentimes they'll mention cremation as a Masonic practice that's actually an anti-body practice. It's against the holiness and goodness of the body. And here, the whole point of that is just to say, guess what happened at Vatican II? Oh, it's either Vatican II or the updated canon law in 1983. Either one. You have the allowance now of cremation. And in fact, many Novus Ordo churches have no problem whatsoever with cremation, which for many centuries was condemned as a Freemasonic anti-body practice.
Even embalming is altering the body, and it doesn't exist in the Orthodox Church. Of course, it doesn't mean that if you're embalmed, you cannot be resurrected and stuff like this. Saint Athanasius talks about it, but just because resurrection of the flesh is full doesn't mean you can start tattoo yourself and get cremated and things like this. And again, the justification will probably be something based on scholastic theology.
Yes, right.
You can justify anything you want.
Okay, so what's next? And by the way, James made an interesting argument. I had not heard of this, but of course we know John Paul II, the Great, quote unquote, is now canonized for the normative Novus Ordo Church. But apparently the Polish clamored for his heart. I didn't know this. I trust that he's correct in that claim. I haven't researched to look and see, but he was just making the point that here you have still this notion, this pagan tradition holdover that we need his heart, for magical powers. If we get a chunk of his heart, then, we'll have more power in Poland, or I don't know. It's kind of ridiculous, but he was making the argument that goes back to the body division practices of the Teutonics and the blood piety of the Carolingians.
Yeah, so on all levels, you can see that Rome was subverted. It was subverted politically, doctrinally, in terms of its practices. It in several waves, it takes centuries, but there's still lines. We can see this shift. We can see that Rome starts to justify itself differently, starts to interact differently, start to have new understanding of dogma, new understanding of councils.
By the way, beatific vision, I can't forget this one, but as we know, the Roman Catholic Thomistic doctrine of beatific vision, which is dogmatized in Denzinger, by the way, it's not a Thomistic opinion, it is dogma, distresses the intellects being satiated in the eschaton by the essence of God, which, again, Orthodoxy, of course, does not believe that. We never see the essence of God, as St. Maximus says. In the eschaton, we will see the things around God, namely the logi. We will experience the energies. We never experience the essence of God. But the idea that beatific vision is the satiation of the intellect with the essence of God, that's your doctrine of the eschaton? Really? What about the body? You see, I mean, here you have, again, this Hellenic and Platonic doctrine and pagan doctrine of the downplaying of the importance of the body, whereas in Orthodoxy, the body is crucial. Man is viewed as a holistic being. He is body and soul together, and nous as well. So you can't set soul and body in tension, right? You don't punish the body to save the soul. This is why, we have a different version of asceticism, right? This Palamas says this to Barlaam. He says, we don't mortify the flesh. We do asceticism to control the passions of the body, but we don't try to punish the body, because the body is not the problem.
Yeah, we mentioned this, and yeah, it all participates to disincarnation. You've mentioned Nestorianism, and again, this is another red line. Of course, there is a disincarnation, and people will start to argue, simply based on philosophical categories. The sacraments, technically there's blood in the body, therefore you only get the wafer. You just need water, so you can just get sprinkled for baptism. All of these things is just slowly, destroying the idea of incarnation, the idea of the fullness of the spirit and body. And you talked about the immaculate, no, not the immaculate conception, the beatific vision. The beatific vision is a pure experience of the nous, and this is condemned in the anathemas against Origen, if you can correct me. The idea is that it's purely about the nous.
Right. Ultimately, beatific vision is the Origenist doctrine, because Origen's conception of man's telos is to see God and never experience any change. So you have to be in a state of perfect stasis. It's a Platonic doctrine that the intellect has to return to its primeval form, or the monad. Right. If it can return to its archetype, the monad, then it will be perfectly satiated in stasis, and then it will never move or change. So Origen's notion of the fall is that before creation, all of these intellects, these perfect forms, namely us, were around the monad, the essence. We were perfectly satiated, and the reason for the fall is that our intellect was turned away from God's essence to changeable things. We fell down into the created world, and that's his mythological version of Adam and Eve. That's all a bunch of nonsense. It's all gibberish. So we don't believe that. That's all condemned in the Confession of St. Sophronius. Rather, the body is good. Creation of Adam and Eve is as it is presented in Genesis. It's not an allegory for Platonism. And so we believe in the historicity of that, and thus, by extension, in the resurrection, the harmony of the body and soul comes back into its proper relationship as it was intended to be in Eden. And we see that most preeminently in the resurrection of Christ, right? When Christ is resurrected, it's the same body. He doesn't have some thought. He doesn't inhabit a thought form, right? He has the same body that he had. Here, put your finger in my side, Thomas, right? You don't put your finger into a thought form. You put your finger into the same body that he possessed that was pierced. So it's now a deified body, and that's the whole point of the resurrection. This, again, what happens in the West, the overemphasis, the obsession with the Hellenic, Platonic, Origenist ideas of satiating the intellect with the essence of God, which, again, I mean, just read Maximus. Maximus does not say that. He would think that's ludicrous. He would say, in fact, all of the ambigua of Maximus are against Origenism, all of it. So he even deals with this question. He says, what is it we'll see in the eschaton? The things around God, the energies, the logi. You don't see the essence of God. And you have a body, by the way. And he actually makes the argument that in the eschaton, we will experience ever-moving stasis. That sounds like a contradiction. Well, if you're Roman Catholic, it would be. But in Maximus' mind, it's not a contradiction because God overcomes the logical antinomies. We're no longer going to be caught in these either ors. We will be perfectly fixed in virtue, but we don't have some weird kind of mental stasis because we have a body. We can still move around. There's nothing wrong with these kind of spatio-temporal relations. That's why it's a new heavens and a new earth, right? It's not, we don't get transferred into a thought form realm. But you notice when you talk to Western Christians, whether quote unquote, whether Roman Catholic or Protestant, they don't even conceive of like the body having, what is the point even of a body in the eschaton? Most people think of it like, well, we're just these little ghosts floating around in some realm of spirits or something. Well, no, wait a minute. I thought you believed in the resurrection.
Yeah, why would it be like literally in the creed? I'm waiting for the resurrection of the dead. Yeah, and whenever it's not Neoplatonic disincarnated stuff, it's just bloody stuff, and that's coming to Orthodoxy. I realize that most of the criticism of atheists and Protestant and nihilists against Christianity, they were aimed at a specific Western understanding. The understanding that oh, you are saved because of the passion. You are saved because of Christ was tortured.
Yes.
No, you're saved because he fully assumes the entire humanity and he died. And not only did he die, he is resurrected. There's not one without the other. It's
right.
The person of Christ dying according to the human nature and being resurrected according to divine nature. And when you understand soteriology, being your salvation through the natures, through being fully incarnated,
right,
and not through the passion and blood and how many wounds and stuff like this, you realize the fullness of Christianity, and that's what I realized coming from this. It's very disincarnated and very.
Well, and that avoids the prelest and the delusion and the temptation to prelest and delusion that we see in people like Francis or the stigmata types where, I'm not really following Jesus until I have literally all of the wounds and, whippings and bleeding. If I'm not really bleeding and having all these wounds, then I haven't really suffered like Jesus did. I'm not really united to Jesus, which is ludicrous. But anyway, all right, where do you want to take us next? Do you have anything you want to?
It was most of the things that we wanted to cover. So just wanted to set this grand narrative showing that political problem lead to ecclesiological problem, lead to theological problem, lead to everything else. So I think this is a good conclusion we have right now, showing that because of the errors of the Franks that permeated through the entirety of Rome, through the entirety of Rome's post-schism history, you have this church in the state that it is now. And
I wouldn't mind it maybe in the future too at some point. Do just a whole show on the Avignon papacy. I mean, that itself is fascinating and it's so bizarre. Maybe down the road we can do a whole just Avignon, Western captivity analysis. Oh
yeah, sure. I will need to study it a little bit further, but that's very interesting. The relations between I thought that Rome was a magic city. I thought that it's special because Peter died there, which is a completely ad hoc.
That's all these arguments we hear from the Roman Catholic apologists that suddenly it doesn't matter during this period. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And by the way, Vatican I appeals to some of these things. So I'm not sure how the appeals at Vatican I can line up with what happens at the Avignon papacy, but I'm sure there's a scholastic treatise somewhere that makes it all work out just magically somehow.
Yeah. I have an anecdote, and it's not about Avignon, but the idea of the Pope, you just need the Pope. You have this present after the Council of Constance, the Council of Constance.
Oh, yes.
Which, you have one Pope that is singled out and just lives in his villa somewhere in Italy, and he says that, the church is not in Rome, the church is not in Constance, the church is in my villa right now with my. So, yeah.
Is that the same villa where there's the coke parties and the orgies? Is that the same one? Is that the one we identify as where the church is? Okay, the church is my villa.
Yeah,
okay.
Here goes monetization, but yeah, that's something very interesting, and sometimes you discuss with people that will say that, Peter founded Antioch, Peter, is a disciple of Peter, founded Alexandria, Peter founded many churches, but Rome is special because he died there, but it's an Avignon,
Exactly. Right.
So first of all, you're making ad hoc categories because there's no specific idea of someone dying somewhere consecrating the see for quite a long time.
Good point.
Yeah,
But what they'll say, well, that's all true. Rome is special because the See of Peter is in Rome and it's forever connected to the eternal city. And Peter gave it some sort of magical preeminence because he died there. But during the Avignon papacy, because the Pope has the supreme power, authority, and all that, he can also change it to be in France for a time period. And he can also change it back. So you see, it's like...
This category is ludicrous because if you look at churches in Greece, we have no problem saying that they were founded by Peter or by Paul or by John.
Right.
Paul died in Rome as well. Something interesting as well, Saint Clement died in Sevastopol in Crimea. So if Clement was a successor of Peter, did he have the full charisma of Peter, or and if the charisma of Peter establishes patroncy whenever someone died, does that mean that submit to Sevastopol?
Submit to Sevastopol.
It's just a one-off. Things like this. Very, very interesting question. You make ad hoc categories, you try to justify yourself.
It's ad hoc, exactly. It's all ad hoc,
and
right?
That's not very interesting, yeah.
And it's retroactive too. Like something will be, maybe it happened later, but it's also I can retroactively make it true back then. All kinds of sophistry and all this.
Yeah, it's just trying to protect the system. And again, I will conclude on that, and then I will give my thanks. But yes. We are not haters of France and the Franks. We are not haters of Rome. We understand that there was a problem that started with the Merovingian dynasties. Carolingian dynasties is a clear shift between the Merovingian and the Carolingian, and Rome was the first casualty. Mm-hmm. We're not fighting with the seas and stuff like this. Rome was the first casualty, and Rome tried to help us. And so there's this letter, that many Catholic will say is not genuine, and Snek says it's not genuine, but somehow we still find it very late in Jesuit books, and we start to see it being denounced whenever the papal supremacy and infallibility started to be a thing. But there's this very touching letter of John to Photios that says that there is a problem in the West, and we should not act too fast. We should try to calm down, and we should try to heal the West. That's a plea that John VIII gives to Saint Photios. We should heal the West. We should heal it from this action with the Filioque. Many people who say this letter is not genuine. It still matches pretty well with the action of John VIII with Photios. So yeah. I think this is very touching, and that's what we need to understand. And in the West, we're also close to movements that are a bit more traditionalist, that are a bit more conservative. Of course, we need to tell them, if you want a monarchy, the only way to have a real symphonia, the real way to have a monarchy that works is our way. What's going to happen whenever you're going to have a pope that opposes you? Today, the pope is opposing the rights of your nations.
Yes.
I'm talking to French. To some French monarchists, and I explained to them, we have the same faith as Clovis, we have the same creed as him. You can't even get the baptism of Clovis today in your churches. You are not submitted to another nation.
Yes, that's a great argument. Yeah.
Yeah, but you are not submitted, in your discipline to Russia or to Romania. But if you're Roman Catholic, you're submitted to the ordinary universal magisterium, which is a submission of full submission of the will in matters of discipline as well for everybody. So this is what we need to try to understand. You are taking back not only your history, but you are taking back your spiritual freedom. And I'm not talking about freedom in a postmodern sense of nothing is settled and stuff like this. No, you are reclaiming your legitimate history, and that's what we're doing in France, and that's what we are doing on my Discord server. We have people who are translating this. We have people who find sources from the Gallicans, for example. We are working with local clergy to, for example, right now we are translating the Menologion of the local French saints. And if anybody wants to help us, if anybody knows translating from English to French, please feel free to come. We have a lot of work. This is what we are reclaiming. And it's established, and it's not a conspiracy theory. The Frankish Thesis is something that's admitted by our church. It's something that's admitted on an academic level. It's something that we know historically. And the real revisionists here are mostly the many Roman Catholics. People who controlled history for quite a while. People who changed the history of countries because there was one who controlled, the information for quite a while. And we've seen it with Gregory of Tours. Gregory of Tours, first book, first chapter, second paragraph. There's already forgeries being inserted to legitimize the Frankish, the carolingians and the Papacy. There's already forgeries. As a French person, we believe that our history starts with the baptism of Clovis. In the first lines of the first book about our history, as a people, Frankish people, there's already Roman forgeries there, trying to rewrite our history. This is terrible.
Awesome. Excellent stuff. Thank you, Snek. And thank you for your work. It's invaluable. And we'll have some of the referenced sources down here below in the description. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, comment below, and send this to your trad friends, because if they want to be trad, then they need to be Orthodox. All right. Anything else?
No, thanks everybody. Thanks to people in my Discord. Thanks to people in your Discord. Thanks to French clergy. Anybody who supports us, Major Proshka. Everybody, yeah, it's great to have your support. And we're working. If you want sources, please come to our Discord. We have many stuff. We find forgeries. If you want to help us, there's Jay's Discord, mine. This is my Twitter where I try to put some stuff.
Yeah, I'll have a link below to that as well. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Everybody have a good night.